Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the first episode of Season 2 of the PMA-CIBC Summit Series. Before we get started with our program, we acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse nations, Inuit and Métis. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land, and by doing so, we give our respect to its first inhabitants. Because our audience this morning is national, if you're joining us from outside of the Toronto area, I encourage you to learn more about the traditional territories where you live, learn, and work. So welcome on behalf of PMA Brethour Realty Group, CIBC, our title sponsor, and our media partner, McHewitt. We are thrilled to have you all join us. My name is Chris Markovic, and I am the CEO of PMA Brethour Realty Group and your session moderator today. I'd like to take a moment to mention the announcement this week of my appointment to the CEO role at PMA. I'd first like to thank Andy Brethour, the PMA leadership team, and all of our staff and clients for your support, guidance, and trust as I make my first steps as the CEO of a firm that has shaped this industry for the past 58 years. We're developing some best-in-class strategies and initiatives for the industry, which will strengthen our position as the premier service platform for high-value strategic sales leadership. Client service and advisory has always been the cornerstone of our brand. And to reinforce this position, we are thrilled to announce that we have established a unique partnership and collaboration with an industry veteran, Jeannie Shim. With this partnership, PMA will be launching high-value offerings to the development community with a focus on the customer experience and a focus on identifying and adding incremental value to the clients and projects that we serve. Welcome to the team, Jeannie. We love having you here with us. So back to the CIBC PMA Summit Series. We are now in our second year after an amazing response to Season 1 from viewers like you. Thank you. Before I introduce our panel this morning, here are some fun highlights from Season 1.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome once again to our CIBC PMA Summit Series. So how do we make this thing work? How do we take this COVID environment and actually take advantage of it and run it more smoothly and more effectively? And I know that people say hope is not a strategy, but I maintain that all strategies begin with hope.
This was all stuff that was coming anyways. COVID has just sped it up. We look at other markets, other places in the world. None of this stuff is new. It's just the value has shifted.
Oh no! The video's not working.
We'll be graduating recovery into some sort of a recessionary territory. And after we deal with that, then by 2022, I see the light.
And that's to get condominium managers and property managers involved much earlier, as early as planning the actual building.
To me, the day you think you know everything is the day you might as well put it to bed and go somewhere else, because you learn something every single day.
The basic message is we're going to be okay.
There's no crying in construction.
So now on to the show. I'm thrilled to introduce Andy Brethour, who will bring us up to speed with an overview of our marketplace today, and what we should all be thinking about moving forward into 2021. Andy?
Thank you, Chris. That was a terrific introduction. I'm thrilled to be part of the group today and to be able to take a few more minutes than my traditional kind of warm up. I'm going to say thanks to First Nations letting me make a living here in this beautiful part of the world. That was a very interesting introduction, Chris. Well done. Let me begin with, I'm going to show you a lot of graphs. Frank is following me and he says, please leave me some time. So I'm going to try to move as quickly as I can through this presentation. It's going to be fast. So keep an eye on the graphic headline and the circles within it. And then I'll just touch on the key points as we go, but there's lots of them. We'll make them available to everyone after this presentation on the PMA website. And you're happy to share those and go through them at your detail. And I'll answer any detailed questions you'd like anytime in the future. Well, let me just say that what we're going to try to cover is where we are and where we're going, what kind of experience we've had. You're very familiar with it. It's been quite incredible. Housing has been immune to COVID. It's been quite the opposite. It's been quite spectacular, and how we've adjusted and we're moving forward is really more of the interest of this panel and the group today. Let me begin with maybe a reflection from our federal bankers. These are great wordsmiths. Tiff Macklem, who on Tuesday, sent out a bit of a red flag to the world on what may or may not be happening around us, and as a result, his use of words is really kind of being very cautious. We watch it very carefully. Frank used to work there, so he understands what the Bank of Canada is all about. But it's trying not to spook markets or shake markets, but to shape them. And I can't get over some of his wordsmith, like he was on to what he called low and long mantra, the low and long policy. And I thought maybe he was going to talk about his golf game, but it's about interest rates, low and long. And I've never heard federal bankers, both in the US and Canada, talk about years ahead of low and long. We've never been exposed to that kind of longer term insurance. I don't believe it. I don't think that's in our cards. I think we're going to see rising rates sooner than we expect. But at the moment, they're low and long, waiting for economic recovery before we see some action. The other word he used, which was wonderful, what a beauty this was, I'm going to have to read it. Extrapolative expectations, extrapolative expectations. It took me a minute to try to figure out what that meant. Extrapolative expectation was that the consumer extrapolates from the current condition and sees an expectation of rising prices and moves into housing in a significant way. And of course, that has already happened. The extrapolative part is the concern the Bank of Canada has that we may be, in fact, be on a rising speculative environment. Big watchword here, big warning, be careful of what we see in front of us from the Bank of Canada and therefore our banking community. They eased off on the approval process regulatory that they put in place by last April. That helped us through the COVID period. I suspect we're going to see that tighten up again. The best was from Alan Greenspan in 1996. Irrational exuberance. It was all about the pre-bubble of the period just ahead of the tech burst in 2000. Irrational exuberance became part of our common language related to bubbles and asset bubbles that go to the moon and then come apart. So are we in the middle of this irrational exuberance again? Are we in an extrapolative expectation? I think we're there. We're almost there. We're not at the point where we're at a bursting point, but we're at a point of pushback. And I'll touch on that in just a very couple of minutes. The drivers of housing demand are immigration, population growth, household formation, household income, employment levels, supply, interest rates, and of course, this COVID calamity. So let's just touch on, I'm going to blast through this quickly. Let's begin with these slides. Let me look at immigration. Right through, there we go. At first, when I looked at this and began to think about immigration, I thought that we were in a period that had stopped, that it was at zero. Well, it never went to zero. It was at 50%. That's a huge reduction, of course, but you have to remember immigration takes 3 years to process. So new immigration effectively now in 2020 of last year was processed in 2017 or 2016. And so the deterioration in the numbers in 2020 were really just the non-processing of immigrant numbers. The federal government is committed to 1.2 million over the next 3 years, over 400,000 a year. Now, I expect that the immigrant levels aren't going to improve much for 2021. 2022, back it comes, but it's going to take a couple of years to process this. The interesting part is that historically, as much as 30% of our immigrant nationally has come to Toronto, the GTA. If we were 350,000 annually, 100,000 to 120,000 was coming into the GTA. This 1.2 million over the next 3 years is 250,000 new immigrants, probably representing at least 100,000 new households. So there's your underlying demand moving forward. Whenever that begins to kick in, is part of an exuberance that you're going to feel. It's great for the rental market. It's tremendous for high-rise condo, as that the rental market will recover with this move back to immigration. When does that start? Probably later this year. Let's go next slide. Melissa, thank you. Well, population inflow, very interesting. It's really that net red one. Look at that red one of intra-provincial outflow. And Frank's going to talk about this a little bit, or I'm sorry, Diana, I think, from Frank's team about this and the movement of the millennials outside, migration outside of the Toronto CMA. This is a remarkable number. This is a number that's been increasing quite steadily. It's not really a significant number in the case of what's happening within the CMA because it's still very, very strong. And of course, the new immigration coming will flow that, but this outflow is quite pronounced. Next slide. Well, income levels up 14% since this is household income average in the Toronto CMA. Yeah, just stay there for a minute. This income levels now at 125,000. What I'm going to touch on later is how does this income balance against housing affordability? And Frank's going to specifically get into the housing affordable issue. I expect we're going to see an income push for surge of response once we come through an economic recovery by the fall. So we're going to see that particular income average household move higher, but prices are moving exponentially faster than income can keep up. Next one. Next slide. Okay, COVID. I won't spend too much time here other than to reflect upon the psychology, the words of our Tiff Macklin, the extrapolative expectation. When you're locked down in that period of April of last year for 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, depending upon where you were and what it was, the psychology of the market was impacted. Now we're heading in the right direction. I want to show you this good news. Next slide. This is lockdown on the right track. Again, deaths and cases dramatically falling. This is weeks, January to last week, dramatically falling. This is all really good news. But the psychology of the market said, I'm locked down in my place. I am getting out of here. I hate this place. And as a result, you had this surge of activity looking for bigger, smaller, different work from home influences, a whole variety of review of our life in this period over the last year. Next slide. So the vaccine's working. Long-term care homes have been all vaccinated now, and you see this dramatic decline. It's really working. It's going to continue to work. They're expecting herd immunity in some parts of the US by the end of April. We're probably not there until September, but this is really working. So this is all really good news in the period. I wouldn't be too concerned about the fear mongering of variants. We will adapt to that, and you're going to now see the reopening of this economy slowly and steadily as we go. But the mentality of the consumer has changed. Let's keep moving. So employment, we haven't sold a house to the unemployed. It's been a standard statement of my father for a long, long time. I don't ever remember when we last did. Unemployment is still rigidly high. We haven't recovered yet in the GTA economic position, and that's going to take some time. That's why you've got this low and long interest rate policy from the federal government, our Bank of Canada. That's going to remain with us until the economy shows some real signs. Well, that's a great sign for housing, of course. Next slide. Free money. Here's from 1981 when I was the first guy on the block with a 21 mortgage rate made the front page of the Star with a big smiling picture of me saying even the experts could be wrong. Today's rate, of course, posted is at 5-year at just under 5%, but the actual rate is less than 2. This is just unbelievable. Now it has inched up. It's inched up just a little wee bit in this last little while because of demand. I think it continues to move forward as we see a couple pressures on inflation coming down the pike, but I'll talk about that a little later. Anyway, free money at the moment, and that's been part of the driver. Keep going. Next slide. Well, what happened in rental? This is really important because this is where the condo market resale, existing condos began to suffer. You see in April where it peaked, apartment rental supply at over 8,000 units. That was effectively half the listings on MLS. That has dropped significantly as we come into 2021, and the uptake on leasing is very stable. In fact, holding. This is a really good sign. Listings are down, leases are up. This is really important. Next slide. Well, rental rates, of course, didn't collapse, but they were off significantly, 14 to 16%, depending upon product type. And that held pretty solidly right through till now. And that's just beginning to change. Next slide. Vacancy rates soared. This is, of course, purpose-built, which is a small sampling, but it is reflective of the overall vacancy rate picture in the city. Next slide. So resale market. Well, what's been happening? Here's really a beauty, and Frank pointed this out publicly just a week or two ago. For the first time, the regions, Durham, Peel, York, Halton, around us, have exceeded Toronto's average MLS price. Who would have thought? Well, of course, you have to take out detached product out of that equation to really look at the comparables, because Toronto's distorted by the condo price point. But the burbs are higher than Toronto, part of the surge factor that has crept into the marketplace of let's move. Next slide. Recovery to normal. Well, monthly sales and resales were down dramatically, of course, in April. They've recovered back to the normal level. We saw 92,000, I think the number shows there for the annual. It's coming right back to its level and should actually exceed this into 2021. We expect we'll see this up by at least 12 to 15%. So you're going to see resale activity in the 115,000 range for 2021 and continuing into 2022. Next slide. Monthly inventory. Oh my goodness, there is just nothing out there. Why do prices go up? Supply, demand, supply, demand, supply, demand. We are at some of the lowest levels ever recorded in terms of availability of product. Now, this will change a bit into the spring as more product comes to market, but the absorption levels are so high, it won't last. Next slide. Condo resales, recovery's underway. This is really important. We thought that condo was going to suffer for a while. We didn't expect to see real change here until the end of Q2. But already in January and February, the market responded. The consumer is so smart. The investor gets it right away. There was a January surge, continuing with a February surge. And what that meant was that prices had come off by 12, 13%. And, the vacancy rates were going up and the investor got nervous, but there was a crowd there that jumped right on board, particularly first-time buyers seeing the great value. And this has caused an early surge in January and February of condo resales. That's a great sign. We think recovery is underway. Supply is still high, but we're right back to the 10-year average on condo generally. Keep going. Next slide. So recovery underway, but supply much tighter. What a fascinating picture that is, from nearly 8,000 units in October down to 3,200 in February. This is a dramatic change. It's a slightly higher supply than we had a year ago, January, but still very tight. So now you've had this supply adjustment take place really quickly. We call that recovery underway. So we're going to have a recovery in the condo market significantly quicker than we had thought. Next slide. Resale prices. Well, 416 down. This is condo, 905 up. In the condo market, there's that change that occurred. You're going to see this shift around fairly quickly. I don't think that's will be sustained, and that the condo market recovers actually into the April and May of this year, and prices begin to come back. Next slide. Next slide, Melissa. Next one. Next. Okay. Low rise. Whoops. All right. Low rise up, high rise down. This is sales activity. In the sales activity, what you've seen is this surge in low rise. Now it's all on the 10-year average. We're pretty much right there. Condo really not affected that significantly. This is new product, but the low rise product just absolutely zoomed. If we can get product to the market, we're still grossly undersupplied, but if we can get it to the market, the absorptions are really, really strong looking forward. Next. Thank you. Tight supply. We'll look at that. My goodness, we're showing 13,000 units, 2,500 low-rise units where we absorbed 16,000 a year ago. 10,000 high-rise, and we absorbed much more than that, nearly 20,000 units, 22. So you've got limited, very limited supply right at the moment in both high-rise and low-rise product. This will add to price escalation, continuing price escalation, and continuing strong absorption. Next. Let me give you a few touches on things in other asset sectors. The industrial market is absolutely booming. And what we've seen is a movement in industrial space that's been incredible. Now, a lot of this is driven by distribution, the last mile of distribution. Now that we've moved to online, the warehousing of product to be distributed to you at your home. Watch out for a drone revolution. By this fall, you'll have drones landing on your front porch with abundance. Maybe no planes flying yet, but drones everywhere. So the industrial sector is just rocking at the moment. Next slide. Office is the opposite. The opposite is office vacancy. It's not unusual to look at Wellington Place, Bay Wellington at TD Center, and see law firms, insurance companies, the major occupiers of some of this big space, actually down to 25% of their current demand for space, and a whole review going underway, whether in fact, that's part of the work from home evolution. It will spring back. It's going to spring back, but you're going to have significant supply. There's going to be an interesting relook and rework and rethink about our office markets in the urban core. Okay, next slide. So prices are moving dramatically, and that's because of free money, lack of supply, pent-up demand that surged after we were locked down. That's been mostly satisfied. And then the psychology of what we call the elevator virus, those coming out of high-rise or denser parts of the city looking for something different and moving out. This is going to abate a little bit. As the economy begins to recover and begin to open up, the work from home will begin to balance. I think it's a phenomenon that stays in play, but it pulls back from the very dramatic levels that we're in. Lockdown living set me free. That's been part of the philosophy. That's going to continue, and it's affecting far-reaching markets, Collingwood, the ex-urban areas all around, Lindsay, of course, even Ottawa, which has been on a tear. The Hong Kong phenom, no Air Canada at the moment, but 300,000 Canadians who are there that at some point will be free to come home. That could have a very dramatic impact on specific areas of Toronto, Markham in particular, and Mississauga, but nothing has happened there yet, or at least modest, but watch for that in 2021. Work from home reversing as COVID subsides. Not significantly out of the picture, but still changing. Next slide. So the brakes are going on a little bit. We're getting a little pushback on price at the moment. Maybe it will be self-regulating. I don't think so. I expect the Bank of Canada may, in fact, you can leave that slide up for just a second. I expect the Bank of Canada will be honest with a very specific tightening of mortgage rules probably by the spring. But we're limited immigration at the moment, about half, but watch out for 2020 and 2022 and 2023. Affordability crunch. I'm going to leave Frank to talk about that, but we're right at the apex right now. 125 average household income, 20% down on a 950 average. We got pushback happening. Much earlier condo recovery than we expected. The affordability of high-rise condo is just now very obvious measured against surging low-rise prices, and limited income growth until the COVID passes. That's probably Q3, leveling off demand a little bit until we get into the early parts of 2022. In the industrial, office, retail, here's where there's some fascinating things going on, and maybe the answer to housing supply, the conversion of suburban retail. We listened to Mitch Goldhar, some of us yesterday, of Walmart fame and Walmart centers, and of course he's looking at major conversion, RioCan, Oxford, looking at those blank spaces that are already serviced, those parking lots in the midst of Main Street suburban malls. And I think there's a real answer here to affordability of conversion of some of this space. The last mile distribution accelerates the drone invasion that's about to happen, and the industrial market continues to be driven by very tight supply, and that's going to continue really, really strong. The office market's going to be really interesting to watch. And will office space be converted to residential in some form or portion? Long time to do such a thing, but some really creative opportunities there. Retail's the hardest hit and the longest to recover. Residential over retail, providing rental accommodation in these areas is really powerful and can be a really strong contributor. So the year ahead, 21 and 22, is looking tremendous. It will be outstanding. You're going to face some new rules. You're going to see some little softening of demand, and you will see the return of inflation. What to watch, and the warning signs ahead will be push on income levels. You'll see inflation driven by gas prices. One to watch, a major one, is Michigan Line 5, canceled by the Michigan government for May 15th. That's 50% of Ontario and Quebec's oil and gas and propane supply. That's it's almost impossible to believe that it will happen, but it's already been voted and it's in the cards for May the 15th. That's a real tough one if that occurs on Ontario and Quebec. But surging gas prices will be the story. And you may not be surprised to see $100 a barrel again very, very quickly in the next several months, or at least certainly by year end. This is very, very inflationary. Mortgage approvals are a critical area. A lot of fraud going on. Watch it very carefully. Be vigilant, particularly as we move to loan value ratios that are starting to get a little out of balance. And so watch that really carefully. I think in a product world, the townhouses begin to replace small lot singles. They get bigger, they get more exotic, and they replace small lots. And B2B, back to back, may in fact replace stacks as we look forward into 22 and 23. Great years ahead. Have a good one. I hope I kept it fairly close to time. Leave some time for Frank. I'm finished. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. We're thrilled now to have Frank Clayton and Diana Petramala from the Center for Urban Research at Ryerson University. The center focuses on researching the economic impact and aspects of urban issues and policy alternatives in an effort to have economic analysis be central to the formulation of urban policy decisions within the greater Golden Horseshoe. It was the brainchild of Professor David Amborski, economist Frank Clayton, and alumni developer Patrick O'Hanlon. Frank Clayton has devoted his career to the analysis of urban and real estate market issues and policies, initially with the CMHC, and then is head of his own economic consulting firm. Dr. Clayton is co-founder and senior research fellow at Ryerson University Center for Urban Research and Land Development. The center's mandate is to advance the contribution of economic analysis and real estate market understanding to more effective and cost-efficient urban policies with a focus on the greater Golden Horseshoe. Frank, welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chris. My real claim to fame is I'm the father of Jim Clayton, who teaches real estate infrastructure at Schulich School at York University. But I am here on my own persona right now. The inspiration for the work we've been doing at Ryerson in housing affordability, how to improve housing affordability, has been inspired by an economics textbook that came out recently called Order Without Design, How Markets Shape Cities. And it's by Alain Berthaud. And it's an economics book, but Alain Berthaud is trained as an architect, and his work experience has been largely as a land use planner with the World Bank. So it's a book that's written in fairly readable language to non-economists. So I'd urge you to take a look at it. Next chart. Okay, let's go on to the next chart, please. Okay, what we're going to do, what we've come up with is an analytical tool for analyzing housing policy. It's based on Alain Berthol's approach, but we've made it more refined it for the GTA problems. So we're going to talk about identifying the problem. There's really two problems in affordability. One is low income people have a housing problem. And two is that house prices and rents are too high in the overall market for in relation to income in the GTA. Secondly, I'm going to explain the tool very little, and then I'm going to tell what the lessons we've learned, or what policymakers, municipalities in particular, and the provincial government should learn from applying our model. Next chart, please. Okay, there are two housing problems in the greater Toronto area. One is that every society, no matter what urban society, where you are in the world, there are low-income people. And low-income people often have a housing problem. They can't find decent, suitable housing at a price or rent they can afford. So we have that problem in the greater Toronto area. And the surprising thing is that, except in the early 90s when we came out of a great recession, basically the incidence or the percentage of households in the Toronto region in core housing need, this is that have a problem, they have to pay more than 30% of their income for decent, suitable accommodation. That we've been holding steady about 20%, that gray line, about 20%, despite what's been going on in the overall market. So about 20% of households in the Toronto region have a housing affordability problem, and they're in core housing need. Now, the renters, of course, have a much greater problem than owners. About a third of all renters are paying too much for accommodation. And that's a problem. It's been constant in terms of relative terms. I mean, the numbers are up because the Toronto economy and market is growing so much. But in percentage terms, we're holding our own. That it's about 1/3 of renters. And owners, I don't care too much about, 10%, because they're building up equity, or they're older owners who are equity rich and asset rich and income poor, some of them. So they have options, but renters are the ones we should be really concerned about. And they have a problem. No question, about 1/3 of all renters in the greater Toronto area have an affordability problem. Next chart, please. Okay, now the more urgent problem, or the more fundamental problem, and the one that basically municipalities ignore, is the fact that our house prices and rents are high relative to income. Now, this is demographia from last year. We were 5th out of about 90 cities, and the 2020 data just came out yesterday or the day before, and we are still number 5 in terms of not having affordable housing out of 92 global urban areas in the, we are number 5. We could be happy that maybe we're not Vancouver, where Vancouver's number 2, but we are number 5. So we got a real serious affordability problem, which essentially the provincial government is trying to deal with through its recent reforms to the provincial policy statement, the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe. But the fact is, unless we deal with that problem, we are compounding the problem of low-income households, because these low-income households now have to compete for housing with middle-income households. So we have these two problems. When we talk about affordability, it gets very confusing. It gets very vague when people talk about affordable housing, particularly politicians. What are we talking about? Affordable housing for low income, affordable housing for middle income? Because they're basically two separate problems in the sense that they have different solutions to them. Next chart. Okay, I'm going to spend just a couple minutes on this. This is our little model. I hope it doesn't confuse you too much. But the bluish line down here is households by income. So you can see that there are more households in the greater Toronto area in lower income groups than higher income groups. The green area are the people who are by income group who are in core housing need. These are the people who really need housing assistance. The top line is the supply of housing. over the last decade, how much housing was supplied for every income group. And you can see that, as you would expect, that there's more housing provided for higher income groups than for lower income groups. But there is housing being provided for lower income groups, and some of it's direct through government programs. But the other thing is the market does provide housing for middle and lower income groups through something called the filtering process. When somebody moves from a rent-controlled apartment into a condominium, that apartment becomes available for somebody else. So that's a way the filtering process kinds of operate. Okay, so how do we help the low-income people down here? Well, their basic problem, about 80% of them, is an affordability problem. It's not a housing problem. They're accommodated. They got decent, acceptable housing, but they've got an affordability problem. So you've got to supplement their incomes. Okay, that's the way you help these people. Now, what about the middle income here? Because this supply that we've created over the past decade was not sufficient to keep prices from rising. So what's the macro solution to getting housing prices more affordable or keeping them from rising? You raise this line, okay? You raise this supply line, or the whole line, not just in the low income groups, because you have the filtering process working. So even if you get high income housing, it helps people in the lower income groups through or middle income, lower income group through a chain of transactions. Not that it's going to solve the whole problem of lower income, but these people are being hit by lack of income, and they're being hit by competition from the middle income group. So we got to raise that up. Now, how do you raise that up? There's only one way of raising it up, and that is to increase the supply of housing. And how do you do that? Well, you've got to get more land through the planning process faster. That's the only way you're going to do it. Okay, so that's the solution to the macro problem, which we're not dealing with in a big way, by the way. We're moving a little bit in the directions. Okay, next chart. One of the problems is that municipalities are now taking money, and the federal government and province as well, are taking money that they would have given to low income groups and targeting middle income groups, because we got this dual problem in places like Toronto and Vancouver, that lower income households and middle income households are having affordability problem. So here's a study that just came out by Steve Pomeroy from the University of Ottawa, that says CMHC's major program right now for stimulating, getting more housing on the market is the Rental Housing Finance Initiative. That program is targeting middle income groups, not low income groups. So here we are spending our money, getting more low income housing, and we're not spending it on the low income. And that's one of the problems when we miss what the problem's all about. Okay, next chart, please. Okay, from our model, here's a few things that we've come up with, which I thought might be of interest. We've got to understand that there are two separate affordability housing challenges, and they both have different causes. One is low income, the other is a lack of new housing coming on the stream much faster in a range of new housing. Markets will not provide acceptable housing, affordable housing for many low-income groups. The market can't get to the lowest income groups. The market can't do it. It can provide housing for 80% of the households out there, but can't provide for everybody. Housing is too expensive for many middle-income groups. Those are the problems. So, lesson 2, next chart. How do we do it? Okay, we have to have coordinated action by all municipalities. You can't increase the supply in the city of Toronto and have any impact on prices. The market's a regional market. People would just simply move to the city of Toronto from region of York or Peel region, or more immigrants would come to the city of Toronto. If the city of Toronto suddenly miraculously put so much housing on the market that it's reduced the supply. Same with York region or Peel region. This means, since we do not have a GTA level of government, this means the province has to do it. Then the province is trying. But it's really, we got to get it to the next problem. Okay, next chart, please. Next lesson. Okay. Sustained improvement and overall housing affordability in the GTA is dependent upon a huge increase in service land supply for a range of housing types and densities in both built-up areas and greenfield areas, which is continually refreshed. This is what the provincial policy statement says in policy 1.4.4. I just hope the province really enforces it, because unless we get serious, and this requires the province, because the individual municipalities won't do it, unless we get serious about, as a region, increasing the supply of housing, all types. And it can be townhouses, like Andy said. It can be, because people, if they, you know, the small lot singles, a lot of people would prefer a townhouse than a lot of these very, very, very small lot singles, if the product is out there. But we got to have ground related housing as well as high rise. Lesson 4, the supply of housing service land for a range of housing in both greenfield and intensification areas should be housing priority number 1 of the GTA municipalities. In fact, I would argue, but I'm not a policymaker, I'm just an economist. I would argue that it probably should be number 1 priority of the GTA. But unfortunately, what happens is that people don't really understand things too much about the macro, the overall market indication. So we seem to have the flavor of the month municipal concerns. Like right now, it's equity and inclusiveness, save the planet, get rid of the car. These are the priorities municipalities coming out with. They're declaring themselves green cities and so on. But every time you put your priority over there, it means housing costs are going to go up more because you're not looking at housing costs and with a factor that we need more land. So the conclusion is simply is that affordability is a problem. It's a dual problem in the Toronto region. And unless we handle the overall affordability problem of prices and rents being too high relative to incomes, we're going to always have very, very high housing costs. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. You know, you had mentioned lesson number 4 and housing priority number 1 is the supply of service land. So what is the likelihood that the supply of service sites will increase enough over the next few years to actually have a positive impact on market-wide affordability?
They will increase more than certainly in the past decade. But you know, it's just a machine. You've got to turn around that to turn the planning system around to produce a lot more, like double the supply of lower density housing and so on. Even if you really were serious about it, it would take a long time. So we're moving in the right direction. The provincial government is certainly moving in the right direction by what its reforms of the provincial policy statement. But it's really got to enforce the land inventory policies of the provincial policy statement and really push municipalities because they're not going to do it on their own.
Excellent, thank you. We're starting to get questions trickle in. One that's more of a housekeeping question. Frank, can you just, you mentioned the book at the beginning of your intro.
Yes.
Could you just let us know one more time?
Okay, it's a book by Andy Brethour, B-E-R-T-A-U-D. It's called Order Without Design, How Markets Shape Cities. Excellent.
I may go off a little bit here, and normally, you know, those of you who joined us last year for season 1, we have a great draw at the end of each session for the CIBC sponsors lunch gift certificates. We may end up using the draw to give away a few of those books in future episodes. So thanks for that.
Okay.
Diana Petramala is the senior economist for the Center of Urban Research and Land Development at Ryerson University. She has 10 years of experience in economic analysis that includes 4 years as a housing and real estate expert at the TD Bank. Diane is also vice president of the board of the Toronto Association for Business and Economics and holds an honors Bachelor of Arts degree in economics and financial management and a Master's of Arts in economics. Her research lies in policy analysis, focusing on urban policy issues, including affordable housing, transit, and job creation. Diana, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. And Frank, I do have to say, I always thought Jim's claim to fame was that he was your son. I definitely do think my claim to fame is that I work for Frank Clayton now. So millennials are now just entering the stage at which they can be expected to become first-time home buyers. And they are the largest group of first-time home buyers this province has ever seen historically, even bigger than, you can go back to my previous. Sorry, I'm a millennial stuck in an apartment. As economists, we believe density leads to a negative externality of noise, and you are about to be part of that negative externality now. Okay, so millennials are the biggest group of home buyers the province has ever seen, even bigger than the boomers. And so I've titled my presentation, "We Told You So," because if anyone's seen Frank speak or read his commentary, we know he ends all of his commentaries, presentations, and even conversations with, "We need to build more ground-related housing." And 2 years ago, we embarked on a demographic analysis to track what housing demand for millennials was going to look like over the next decade. And so I'm going to present the research here. I'm going to show you how we predicted some of this demand that we're seeing now, especially for ground-related housing in the suburbs. Next slide, please. Now, there's a typical path households take as they age. We start off living at your parents' house. You move out on your own, and typically that's always been into a major urban center like the city of Toronto. And then you are maybe a renter. And then as you age and get older and want to have a family, you start to move out of the city center into the suburbs, into larger space. This is something that we've seen fairly broadly across time, something we've seen with the boomers, as they were entering their young years, they created the development of the annex, and then even Yorkville, and then out into the suburbs as they aged. So we're going to show you how millennials are moving through their path of becoming households. We're going to show you how this is resulting in pent-up demand for ground-related housing, and then how we do expect that the millennials would be moving out into the suburbs looking for housing, and then we can have a bit of a discussion about whether some of the strength we're seeing now in housing demand is impact related, or is this just pent up demand? So next slide, please. Next slide, please. When we did our report at Kerr, we focused on millennials in the Greater Toronto area and Hamilton area. I've updated it here for the Greater Golden Horseshoe, and also at the time when we did the report in 2018, millennials were not quite well defined. Everyone had their own definition, and we had used what StatsCan was using at that time. Those born between 1981 and 2001, but millennials have now become better defined, and the more broad definition is now those born between 1981 and 1996. So I've updated the numbers to reflect the two different definitions. So what we found at the time was there were 800,000 millennials living at home with their parents or a relative in the Greater Golden Horseshoe. This is 600,000 in the city of Toronto alone. The second most common living arrangement of millennials were either married or common law. And then the most unlikely scenario for living arrangement for millennials was whether living alone or with a roommate. That led us to believe that millennials, and we'll see, still had the same type of family values as generations that had come before them. They stay at home until they're ready to move off into marriage or partnership. We had estimated that the aging of the millennials was going to lead to a really sharp increase in the number of new households per year between 2021 and 2031. And we expected many millennials to age into the suburbs. So there were a lot of millennials still living at home with their parents in the suburbs, and surveys out of the US showed that millennials choose housing based on a few criteria, but the number one criteria was affordable housing. The second criteria was living near their parents or friends. Third was near schools, and the fourth was then amenities. So the need to find affordable housing and be near their parents and friends, we thought would keep many millennials living in the suburbs, and those who had moved to the city moving back to the city as they were ready to have children. And their huge demand for millennials was not being matched by supply. So we did anticipate that home prices would continue to rise faster than household incomes, which is what we're seeing. Next slide, please. Here we're looking at population numbers by individual generations. So Generation Z, Millennials, Generation X, and Boomers over time. And the numbers in the bracket represent their ages at that point in time. And the key takeaways from this chart is that millennials are aging. So by the time we did our report, they were between the age of 20 and 35. Now in 2021, they're between the ages of 25 and 40. the millennial demographic is growing rapidly, and this is because many of the people tend to immigrate within that age group. So much of the immigration we're seeing in the region are of the millennial generation. And the third takeaway is that millennials are now larger than the boomers currently are, but also larger than they were when they were in the same age group. And another takeaway that I find really interesting is that Generation Z is actually growing faster than the millennials, and I think are going to be a significant growth or source of demand for housing, even once the millennials are well settled and in their homes for the long term. Next slide, please. So what we're looking at here are home ownership rates across time and by age. And so there are three takeaways from this chart as well. The first one is, as people age, they become more likely to become homeowners. So as of 2016, millennials were not quite at that age where they would be considered homeowners. The real leap into home ownership occurs from 15 to 20, or from when you start entering your late 20s, so after 25. And then there's another big leap into home ownership between 35 and 44. And by the time households are 45, 3/4 of households can be expected to be homeowners. Now, if we look at this across time, 2006 was a high watermark for home ownership rates. They've come down for all age groups a little bit over the 2006 to 2016 period. But home ownership rates for millennials were still historically high. Millennials who were between the age of 15 and 34 when we were doing that report. So the belief that millennials are going to want to be homeowners, like generations that have come before them, is still, was what was driving our estimates for housing demand at that time. Next chart, please. There's a lot of fake news that millennial women are not going to have children, and I think the term DINKs, dual income households, no children, no kids, was very popular, but I think we're seeing that being turned on its head. So right now we're looking at fertility rates by age group. And we do see that far less women, so these are number of births per 1,000 of women by age group. And we do see that women between the age of 15 and 29 are having less children. And that is in large part because they're going to school, starting off their career, or trying to build a nest egg, and that building that nest egg is taking longer. But we're seeing birth rates for women between the ages of 30 to a 44 increase. Birth rates among women 35 to 44 have actually almost doubled in the last 20 years. So millennial women are still having children. In the past, when a woman may have had 2 or 3 children, it becomes harder to catch up if you start having your children at a later age. So they might not have as many, but they're still having children. There's an article I read out of the US that said that women, by the time they're 40, even if they weren't married, then they were looking for alternative sources to have children. So women were ditching the husband, but keeping the child. Next chart, please. Now here we're looking at housing preferences by age group between 2006 and 2016. So percent of households that would be living in high-rise apartments, low-rise apartments, ground-related apartments. And what we do see is there is a tendency for younger households to live in high-rise apartments, and then the preference starts to shift into ground-related housing as households age. Millennials were showing, and by the time your households are 45, again, 3/4 of them would be preferring to live in ground-related housing based on historical preferences. Millennials were showing a slight increased a preference to be living in high-rise apartments, but that might be an affordability issue. As many surveys were continuing to show that ground-related housing and townhouses were still preferable housing among first-time home buyers, and that apartments came last in terms of preferences. The other thing about this chart too is the downsizing of boomers. So everyone's waiting for boomers to downsize so millennials will have access to housing, but downsizing isn't really a thing in Ontario. or the Greater Golden Horseshoe. So if you look, your preference for ground related or for high-rise apartments really does decrease as you age, as households age. And then at the 75 plus, there is a little bit of a tendency for older households to move back into high-rise apartments, but it's not very large. By far, the large bulk of them will remain in a ground-related house. And even the province of Ontario government's own estimate is that the downsizing of boomers will not have an impact on the real estate market until 2041. And boomers now, like the oldest boomer is 75, so the bulk of them are still in that peak ground-related housing sort of life cycle part of their lives. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for new household creation? So we're looking at here forecasts, past and future forecasts of households for ground-related housing and apartments on the right-hand side. The blue bar being the average annual increase in households between 2006 and 2016, green bar being the forecast between 2016 and 2021, and then the gray bar being between 2021 and 2031. And then the yellow bar being comparing that to what's been supplied in the housing market, so housing completions. And at the time we did our millennial report, we had estimated that there would have been a shortfall of 60,000 if the pace of construction that was occurring were to continue, there would be a shortfall of 60,000 units of ground-related housing. But because immigration has really increased population growth of millennials much stronger than we thought, the numbers are now looking to be more like 100,000, a shortfall of 100,000 ground-related units in the Greater Golden Horseshoe. There is still, for apartments, there's still demand for apartments. You can see between 2016 and 2021, as millennials were in that age of demanding or wanting to be living in city centers in apartments near the action, demand for apartments was much stronger than supply as well. But that even as we see less millennials choosing apartments, again, the size of the Generation Z is going to mean that there's still going to be healthy demand for apartments as well, just more for ground-related housing. Next slide, please. With there not being enough housing being created, you hear a lot of talking about millennials moving around out of the city centers and to other parts, not just the GGH, but of the country. Here we're looking at population growth of millennials between 2018 to 2019, and 2019, 2020, the most recent population estimates we have. And we were seeing that as of July 1st, 2020, Peel and Toronto, millennial population has been falling across cities across Canada, and that's because immigration has slowed, but it's still growing quite rapidly. And Peel and Toronto are still seeing the fastest growth in millennial population because of immigration, and immigration is mostly attracted to these areas. So still strong growth in millennials, even though it is slowing. Next slide, please. Now, what we are seeing though are residents, people who already live here in the Greater Toronto area are leaving in droves, quite large, substantial numbers. So in this chart, we're looking at two things. So the blue line is what we call housing purchase affordability. So that's if you were to go out and buy an average price home, have an average household income, take out a 5-year mortgage rate, and have 20% down, what your mortgage payments as a percent of your income would look like. And that's risen substantially in the last few years. The low interest rate environment now has tempered that increase, or has stalled it a little bit, but affordability is still quite elevated relative to history. It's not the worst period for affordability, that would have been the 1990s, but it's still pretty bad from a historical perspective. And what we've seen is a trend outflow of people who currently already live here from the Greater Toronto area into other areas of Canada, and also of Ontario. So this yellow bar is people moving from the Greater Toronto area to other parts of the country outside of Ontario, and then also to other parts of Ontario. Next slide. And the two seem to be quite related. So where are all these people going? Here we have on the left side, we're looking at the intra-provincial migration numbers now, just people moving within Ontario. And where are they going? People have been leaving Toronto and Peel in large substantial numbers since 2012. That number has been increasing, and it increased even further in 2020. We're seeing positive flows into still Durham and Halton, which are more affordable regions of the Greater Toronto Area. Durham for a really long time was one area where you could still find a single family home for an affordable price. That changed in January. One interesting thing that happened in 2020 was York. York was seeing a huge outflow for its size of people as well, but that turned positive in 2020. On the right-hand side, we're looking at the 5 top destinations in the Greater Golden Horseshoe for households. And the 5 top destinations are Simcoe, Niagara, Hamilton, Wellington, and Waterloo. Relative to 2020, some of the key changes would be that these migration flows slowed for Waterloo and Simcoe, but increased for Niagara and Hamilton. We are seeing a big flow of people moving outside of the Greater Golden Horseshoe too. Ottawa is a particular area of interest, particularly for millennials, and that's because of both affordable housing, but also low interest rate and a lot of good government jobs. Low unemployment rate. Ottawa has the lowest unemployment rate of cities across Canada. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, we do think a lot of the demand we're seeing right now is millennials just unleashing pent-up demand. There is a massive shortfall of ground-related homes, and that's likely going to continue for the next decade. This means that home prices are going to continue to outpace income growth. Millennial demand is going to continue to spill over to the suburbs. If you look at only 30% of households actually live in the city of Toronto. Majority of households live outside of the city of Toronto in general. A lot of these trends have been accelerated maybe by the pandemic. Interest rates hit record low levels in January. But I don't think it was caused by the pandemic. And that's all.
Thanks, Diana. We're coming close to our end here this afternoon now, but we have some good questions that have come in on the Q&A. Jason Pantalone, I'm going to give this one to Andy. Jason Pantalone asks, the pandemic really drove this trend to move to the suburbs. So do you believe that this is just a trend that will reverse and urban centers will be popular again?
It's a good question. Thanks, Jason. It's a mixture. You're going to get an easing off of the work from home component that will cause markets or consumers to shift a little bit back, but it is a trend that will continue. It's driven in many ways by affordability, but Frank's and Diana's outline of where people are going is driving prices in the suburban markets faster than the urban ones. So we may see a little ebb and flow here, but the general trend is going to be continuing strong suburban ground-oriented housing. A recovery in high rise, in resale is expected, and high rise is going to be new high rise is going to have a great year this year and next because there's just going to be tremendous affordable underlying demand. So kind of a mixture in my answer, but when you ask, is it a trend that will continue? Yes, it will. We got to unleash supply, get at those retail plazas, those parking lots. Services are already there.
Excellent. Next question from Philip Stewart. Thank you, Philip. Frank, during past recessionary cycles, population increased in the GTA in response to job access and opportunities. Thoughts?
I'm not sure if population increased. I know the big recession back in the early 90s, population growth continued strong due to immigration, which continued strong. But from other parts of the country, there isn't a lot of net inflow into the GTA. So it's really immigration. So which is not related directly to economic conditions in Toronto. It's more related to more global things and what the federal policy is about immigrants. So I'm not sure there's a relationship there between economic conditions that we've seen in the Greater Toronto area and population growth.
Okay, excellent. Diana, how can millennials afford home ownership?
They've been living at home and saving. If you look at the assets of millennials, they've been really expanding their cash they have. So they have large down payments. I think I heard Brad Lamb saying that he lived at home until he was 35 so he can build his net wealth. So I think that's what you're saying. They're living at home longer, they're making good incomes now, and they have larger down payments, larger nest eggs.
The bank of mom and dad.
And that.
The movement of capital from the boomer crowd to the millennial crowd will be substantial, and there's great asset base there, and I think you're going to see tremendous financial support. I think it's already happening from the bank of mom and dad. It'll be an important part of the next 10 years.
Cost to get your kids out of your basement, eh?
Yeah. How do I get my kids out of the basement?
You pay for it.
And then finally, and this one's from an anonymous attendee, how come Frank and Andy are looking younger and younger each year? So with that, I'd like to thank all of our sponsors.
Drugs. Frank, it's drugs, isn't it? It's drugs, isn't it? Drugs. Yeah. You're muted. You're muted.
Alcohol, wine, scotch.
I'd like to thank all of our sponsors. First off, CIBC, especially Yana Davies and Sherry Speakman. Our sponsors include SR Law, Balcony Bliss, My Design Studio, Sagan, Smart Touch, Next Home, Buzz Home, Build, Orea, Reliance, and Westmount Project. I'd like to thank especially our event producers, McHugh, especially Leanne and Melissa. And now for our draw that is courtesy of CIBC. And our first, Max Lemarchand. Max, expect an email from our friends over at CIBC with your lunch gift certificate. And Mark Emery. Mark, expect your email from CIBC. Our next session will be on March 25th at 11 a.m. We look forward to seeing you then. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon, and have a great month.